Three men rudely mocked this old veteran on a train, but as soon as they recognized the person who sat behind them, they received the shock of their lives, realizing too late the costly mistake they had just made. Mr. George, a veteran in his late 60s, glanced up from the small box in his hands to meet the gaze of the man sitting across from him. "What's in the box, old man?" The younger man, likely in his late 20s, asked with amused curiosity. Unfazed by the blunt question, Mr. George replied warmly, "Just some memories," feeling a bit nostalgic. His voice was soft, but carried a weight of mixed emotions. Sensing there was more to the story, the young man leaned forward, his curiosity piqued, and pressed for details. "Can I see what's inside?" the young man asked, leaning in closer to Mr. George, his curiosity unbridled. The veteran shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the intrusion into his personal space unsettling. He adjusted his posture, hoping his body language would signal the need for distance. However, to his frustration, the young man remained oblivious to the discomfort he was causing, his eagerness outweighing his awareness. Mr. George shook his head gently in response, his voice calm but firm. "I'd rather not," he said, hoping to set clear boundaries. However, his words seemed to trigger an unsettling change. The playful grin on the young man's face faded, replaced by a dark, angry scowl. It was suddenly clear that he did not take rejection lightly. Noting the man's behavior change, Mr. George's instincts sensed trouble brewing. In a few minutes, the old man would realize the unsettling situation he had inevitably walked into that afternoon. Mr. George had boarded the train that afternoon to Edinburgh for a little nostalgia trip. It was his 41st anniversary with his late wife Carol, and he wanted to relive the fond memories along the way. To get the full experience, Mr. George boarded the train Carol enjoyed traveling with, reminiscing as he took in the scenery through the windows. The scent of the misty wind and the gentle sway of the train transported him back to a time when life was simpler. Yet despite the bits and pieces of relief he felt at that moment, the old veteran could not shake off the bitter feelings that had always plagued him over the years. As a war veteran, Mr. George dedicated years to serving his country, enduring the heartbreaking loss of his wife Carol while on a mission in the Middle East. Despite his grief, he returned to duty but ensured Carol was laid to rest in her hometown of Edinburgh. Now retired, he carried a small box of her cherished memorabilia, notes, and photos, his solace in moments of guilt for not being with her in her final moments. On this train ride, he sought peace, hoping to forgive himself, honor her memory, and let go of the guilt he had carried for years. However, mere minutes into the experience, he encountered this young fellow whose initial prying was slowly morphing into something dark and unexpected. As the man glared at Mr. George, he appeared to be calculating his next move, making the old man frown in confusion. He knew things were spiraling out of control and wanted nothing more than to move on from this entire situation. However, the young man was not on the same page, as he had something more of setting up his sleeve. After a few minutes of staring intently at Mr. George with a light sneer, the man finally broke eye contact, seemingly shifting his gaze to something else. The old veteran breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the unusual exchange had finally ended. But seconds later, he realized his assumption couldn't have been more wrong. The young man beckoned over two friends and urged them to sit beside him. Suddenly, he began to poke fun at Mr. George, repeating what the old veteran had shared with him earlier. After recounting the story, one of the young man's friends jabbed at George, amused by the situation. "Memories, huh? Sure, just a bunch of junk and old trinkets," the first man sneered. The third chimed in with a chuckle, "Or maybe a few inappropriate pictures, don't you think?" Their laughter echoed as they enjoyed their mockery. Meanwhile, Mr. George, already mentally strained, urged them to drop the matter for the sake of a peaceful journey. His pleas only fueled their amusement. Pale and disheartened, Mr. George realized the teasing wouldn't stop. Noticing his troubled expression, the third man mocked, "What's wrong, old man? You look worried." Another quipped, "Nostalgic, not troubled." Their laughter grew louder, testing Mr. George's patience. Anger rising, he considered the many ways his military discipline could bring them to order. Although it had been years since he left the force, he reckoned he could still handle Garud men. However, just as he was about to join the 3 men in a face-off, something stopped him midway. Mr. George remembered why he was on the trip in the first place. It is meant to be a solemn journey for reflecting and healing. So the old man decided he would not ruin the sanctity of his trip by dancing to their tune. With that in mind, Mr. George sealed his lips and left the men to continue their verbal onslaught. The young men continued to mock Mr. George, their teases growing vicious and deeper by the minute. But the old man remained resolute, holding his tongue with determination to avoid escalating the issue further. Silently, he scanned the train car, eager to find an empty seat to occupy. But to his greatest disappointment, there were no available slots. Defeated, Mr. George accepted that he would probably have to put up with the men until they arrived at Edinburgh. To take his mind off the men's constant gossip, he gazed out the window, fixing his eyes on the passing landscape while willing himself to be anywhere but there. Mr. George tried to distract himself from the ordeal by pulling out a book to read, but this only fueled the men's mockery. They jeered, asking if the book fed his nostalgia, and one even made a crude comment, suggesting the veteran not only kept inappropriate pictures in his box, but also read dirty novels. When their taunts failed to provoke a reaction, their frustration grew. The first man, feeling slighted by Mr. George's indifference, escalated his insults, joined by his friends. They ridiculed everything from his clothing and posture to his box and book, mocking even his smallest movements. For a moment, Mr. George wondered if anyone else was witnessing this unsettling scene. He looked around, noting the visible faces he could see, only to be disappointed once again that day. Everyone else was busy with their own activities, either gisting with their partners, enjoying the view, or getting engrossed with their digital devices and journals. Sighing in exhaustion, Mr. George resumed his reading. For a second, the men kept quiet with their mockery as they got distracted by their phones. Mr. George was grateful for this moment of rest and hoped it would be uninterrupted until they arrived at their destination. But unfortunately for the old man, an hour of silence was too much to ask for, because as soon as he started to ease into comfortable silence, the men resumed their taunting and teasing once again. Finally reaching boiling point, the old man dropped his novel, preparing to give the gentleman a piece of his mind. However, before he could say anything about the matter, a voice from behind beat him to it. On the chair right behind old man George's seat, a man rose to his feet and turned to face them. He wore elegant apparel and had an air of wealth around him. He cautioned the men to respect Mr. George and maintain decorum on the train. In response, the first man sneered, expressing disgust at being ordered around and mocking the standards of train passengers. His confidence, which had been evident throughout the trip, vanished in an instant when the man who intervened introduced himself as a judge. Without further ado, the judge revealed he had overheard their insults and would report their behavior to the railway board for disciplinary action. Immediately, the 3 men exchanged shocked and troubled looks. They never expected things to go south so quickly. In a bid to plead their case, one of the young men explained, through a nervous chuckle, that they were messing around, terming their entire action as a harmless, friendly banter. The judge dismissed their excuses, warning them to prepare for potential court action. Realizing the severity of the consequences, the men began begging both Mr. George and the judge for forgiveness, insisting they meant no harm and pleading for the veterans' support. However, Mr. George stood firm. He believed they needed to face the consequences to truly learn from their actions. If their behavior goes unpunished, it could harm others in the future. Following the judge's intervention, the railway authorities launched a swift investigation into the incident. After some digging, they discovered that these same men had a record of pestering people, especially elderly ones on the train. While their motives for doing such a thing were unclear, Mr. George reckoned they enjoyed some joy and self-satisfaction. With the evidence stacked against them, the railway authorities blacklisted the 3 men, banning them from traveling with them in the future. They would no longer be able to use the train system, effectively ending their reign of terror aboard it. While the verdict wasn't entirely satisfying, Mr. George felt a sense of gratitude. At the very least, no one else would have to endure such an ordeal on the train again, at least not at the hands of those men. The old veteran thanked the judge sincerely, and from that day on, they formed an unexpected friendship. Upon reaching his destination, Mr. George visited his wife's grave to carry out the heartfelt gestures he had planned throughout his journey. In doing so, he finally made peace with the bitterness that had weighed on him for years. The incident on the train became a turning point for Mr. George. It made him realize that clinging to anger and resentment had only harmed him, chipping away at his self-esteem, something his beloved Carol would have disapproved of. From that moment on, the veteran vowed to face life as his late wife would have wanted, choosing dignity and grace over insults and self-deprecation. I'm really keen to know your thoughts on this story, so please don't hesitate to share your insights in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video and found it engaging, I invite you to subscribe to our channel for more similar content. Feel free to share this video. Take good care of yourselves, and I'm excited to connect with you in our future videos.